What occurs when an experienced police officer with a history of prejudice unintentionally stops the most powerful man in the state? This encounter is going to alter everything. For him, the neighborhood and the justice's future was a silent day along the lengthy section of the route 29 minutes outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, low in the sky. The sun was casting hues of gold throughout the Ted Marshall, an asphalt cop, is a 20-year and experienced police officer sat in his police vehicle parked on the curb. Looking for any cars on the road that attracted his attention, Marshall was well known, due to his nonsensical attitude in the area. And even though it was never formally recognized his habit of focusing on black drivers, he noticed a slick black SUV driving up. Moving only a hair's breadth away, Marshall twisted his lips at the speed limit into a little smile as he extended his hand, for he murmured, "The siren gotcha." Beneath his breath, the SUV dutifully slowed down to, the driver rolled to the side of the road. Down his window when Marshall came over. He was a young black man with a dapper outfit, wearing a tailored suit, and exuding assurance that was impossible to overlook. His composed demeanor remained unwavering, as Marshall inclined Marshall's license and registration barked. His posture was sharp, and his tone. The young man imposed himself and gave away his documents without reluctance, providing a courteous nod. Marshall examined even though it was evident that the licensing, even if the paperwork was in order, he wasn't. "Do you realize why I pulled you?" Satisfied? Marshall's voice was laced with a trace of, "I assume Uke tells me," the condescension. The man's tone was courteous, and he answered evenly. However, Marshall scowled firmly, obviously annoyed by the absence of "You were speeding because you were nervous," declared, even though the charge seemed flimsy, even for him to exit the car. "Please," raised the man's eyebrows. "A little," but he complied by leaving. He stood tall with controlled grace, addressing Marshall's eyes fearlessly or defiance. "Why have you come here?" Marshall circled the car as he pressed, but seeking an excuse to escalate. "The situation works," the man said. Merely putting his hands together before him, Marshall's mistrust only grew, driven not by anything material, but rather by his personal prejudices. Leaning closer, the cop attempted to rattle the man. "You appear incredibly composed for someone who was just stopped. Received something too." The young man concealed a small smile, although his gaze remained fixed. "No, officer, do you?" The remarks were hardened by Marshall's expression. He straightened after hitting a nerve. Hovering over the man attempting to make a statement, control, but not for a long time. Marshall experienced a brief moment of uneasiness, not due to the man's actions, but because of his unwavering appeared to be what began as a typical traffic stop was going to happen. But it was possible to forecast one that would make Marshall wonder about everything he believed he was aware of: power, respect, and justice. Marshall became increasingly irritated as he strolled around the SUV and looked through the windows with heightened attention to detail. He tapped the rear of the vehicle using his flashlight, even though it was still daytime. It was a small, almost automatic gesture. Method of leaving a mark of his Marshall. "Please open the trunk." Instructed, the man paused for a moment. Just enough time to make the officer's suspicions flare. "Is something wrong with my documents?" The man's voice remained serene but now slightly tinted with curiosity. "You seem really worried." When I asked Marshall, he retorted, "Simply open the trunk." The man complied, despite a quiet moan. Strolling to the rear of the vehicle and pressing a button will open it. All that was inside was a tidy packed briefcase made of leather, and a little duffel Marshall dug into the sack. Contents in the bag, carelessly laying out freshly ironed shirts and going through personal belongings when traveling. "Well, what sort of task requires of the man?" leaned in this wardrobe, arms crossed but relaxed against the vehicle. "The type where looks are important. Should I'm worried about how you're acting?" Marshall straightened my belongings. Displaying a completely innocent shaving kit as if it were illegal, he was searching for anything other than the man's stayed. Unconcerned, that calmness just encouraged Marshall's annoyance. "You're incredibly brave for on my roadway." Someone stopped. Marshall sneered. "You're the man on the highway," cocked his head, his voice bearing a subliminal challenge. I was unaware that Route 29 was private. Owned. Marshall moved in closer, toe-to-toe with the man in the hopes of, "You have a clever tongue." So intimidate him. On you that might not be that successful. For the man's ground officer was held by you, said, his voice abruptly becoming lower. Are you sure you want to keep it, really? Mars. Marshall sneered that following this course is... That's hardly a threat, the man said tremblingly. Slightly tilting his head, it's a query. Before Marshall was able to answer, as it passed the passengers, the automobile slowed, clearly taking in the situation, too. The kids seated at the rear pressed their eyes wide with the glass in front of them. Marshall shifted uneasily out of curiosity, abruptly conscious of the, you can cease using theatrics and optics, the man stated in a calm yet forceful tone. I'm not who you believe me to be, and what you're about to discover that Marshall's mouth was wide and prepared to fire back. But the words, something stuck in the man's voice and gave. He hesitated, but his pride prevented him from admitting it. He turned suddenly and started entering the man's details into his patrol vehicle's computer. The findings appeared right away. Marshall and the man was not merely a citizen, and he froze. Elijah was passing through his name. Porter, the recently elected governor of at the screen, Virginia Marshall, blinked. His heart beat. He accelerated and gazed at the man through the windshield, attempting to comprehend what. This indicated that Elijah had moved away from his vehicle, lazily leaning on the driver's door, while Marshall remained motionless. At last, Elijah spoke. So I assume you worked it out by Marshall now got out of his car. His motion was rigid and unnatural. The assurance he had previously displayed had faded. Based on his stance, Governor Porter. He lowered his voice and changed it to something like Elijah pushed off the car out of respect and walked up to Marshall, his face unreadable. What's going on, officer? Marshall. The balance of power had changed. However, it was still unclear what does Elijah do with this revelation moment? Marshall firmly swallowed the burden of the instant he felt pressure on him. He had been exposed for his own prejudice. His own belief that the man in the could be threatened before him and denigrated. But this was not your typical this citizen was the governor. Highest-ranking state official Marshall had just made me feel ashamed. Elijah, though, didn't appear irate. He calmly examined Marshall, intensity as though choosing a course of action. With every passing second, the silence grew longer, intolerable. For the officer at last, Elijah talked. Let's discuss what just occurred, he said in a firm voice but pointed. I fulfilled all of the requests. My documents are in order because of you, breached no laws. But now we're being told me Marshall's lips opened. But he discovered. At the very least, he had no response, could cause him to move uneasily. Clutching his belt as though it were a lifeline. I was merely carrying out my duties, whispered. But even he didn't think Elijah's eyebrows raised a little. Phrase that almost, is that what you call pitying your job? He indicated the open trunk with this gesture. Considering the information that had been ignorantly thrown aside, tell me, officer, do you stop every vehicle, Marshall? Either this, or only those in which the driver appears to Marshall's face flushed, but he was unable to. Ignoring the reality, he avoided looking down. The look in Elijah's eyes. I had no idea who you were. He acknowledged. Elijah said in a tone that was quite hushed, sharpening, you were unaware of my identity. But I was someone you thought you could treat someone like this, dismiss, embarrass, perhaps even threaten. And why, given my appearance? Tell me, Officer Marshall, about the car I drive. Why did Marshall tighten his hands? Not out of rage, but rather into fists at his sides. And shamefully, he started. But Elijah stopped him. Elijah whispered, save it, as his hand cut him off. His forceful but gentle voice said, I'm not here to make you feel inferior. I'm here to instruct you. Something that you may or may not discover is up to Marshall's head jerked up in bewilderment. Teaching me by flickering over his face, Elijah nodded, saying, You'll bring tonight. There's a community forum in a nearby area. You're intending to take a seat and hear the tales about the individuals you say you work for. Perhaps then you'll see the effect of what just took place here. Perhaps then, You'll notice the larger Marshall blinked in shock at the image. You'd like me to attend a Elijah stated in the thread. I don't want you to. You should do this as your governor. There was no room for debate in his voice. Wearing with pride, Marshall paused. The situation's irrefutable reality. However, he knew, in his heart, that he didn't have a selection fine. He remarked sternly, through his tone wasn't as biting. Elijah didn't react right away. Rather, he moved his eyes closer, locked on Marshall's. This isn't about looking foolish. He whispered softly. The goal is to ensure that you never do this. Not out of fear, but to anyone else of who they are. But since you've taught to treat everyone with respect, Marshall looked at him and said, the same thing. He nodded reluctantly as he took it all in. Nevertheless, the turmoil was seen on his face. Making beer. Good inside, Elijah remarked, turning to follow me in his car. And I'll make sure you're as they drove. They were seated, front and center. Marshall couldn't shake his walk toward the forum. The sensation that this evening was going to alter everything, whether for the better or worse. The pair of vehicles arrived at the parking lot of a small community center. Located in a small group of people in Charlottesville had already assembled, their voices blending together amid the bustle of apprehension among folding rows chairs in front of an elevated platform with the microphone was ready to magnify long-ignored voices. Marshall exited his patrol vehicle. He looked uncertainly and hesitantly at Elijah, who was waiting outside his SUV with the same serene poise that he had displayed during their previous meeting. The governor pointed at the structure, indicating with a nod that Marshall should. The place was crowded with men, women, and the chairs were packed with youths, their faces a tapestry of feelings, including fatigue and hope, annoyance and perseverance. Some people looked upon Marshall, as he stepped into their faces and protected his once a sign of authority. Uniforms are now felt like a letter in scarlet beneath their. Elijah guided him to the front row for observation. Marshall sat where a seat had been saved. His hands were firmly on his knees. As Elijah got closer to the microphone, ladies and gentlemen started speaking in a firm and authoritative tone. I appreciate you attending our forum tonight. Exists because your voice is important, as, well, those in authority frequently forget that tonight our purpose is to listen, educate, and grow, which encompasses both myself and other people who service our neighborhood. His eyes flitted understated, yet targeted in Marshall's direction. Whispers filled the room. And then the first speaker to speak was an elderly woman with weary eyes and a trembling voice It started last year when my son was stopped. He was 17, she stated, and had just received his driver's license. According to the police, his taillight was absent, but the following day we checked it. It wasn't. He was so terrified that her voice broke. Called me while whispering in fear. From the automobile. Marshall didn't even reach for his license. His uneasiness caused him to shift in his seat. He clearly wanted to turn away, but his gaze was rooted by the weight of her words. One speaker after another trailed. A young man described being frisked while he fit a bill and decided to stroll home from work. Description: an old man mentioned the terror that overcame him every time his grandchildren moved out when they were teenagers. The youngster said she was asked why she was in a pleasant area, as though her just being there was. Marshall felt dubious of every story. The disintegration of his own defenses. The words were more impactful than he had anticipated. They are all removing layers of denial. He was unaware that he was carrying a small boy who was no older than 10 came forward, the microphone in his tiny hands. The stand while gazing out into the space. My father advises me to always be courteous to police, he exclaimed in a loud voice. But occasionally I feel that even when I'm courteous in any case, they won't like me, right? Indeed, the quiet that ensued was. Marshall's chest clenched deafeningly as he observed the child lowering his query, lingering in the atmosphere like a nobody dared to respond to Elijah's challenge. Looked back at the microphone. Sweeping across the crowd, he said this in a voice laden with, "We're here because of emotion, to confront the harsh realities, to acknowledge the harm that has been completed, and to ensure that the next generation does not learn to think." He discovered that respect is a one-way street. His expression toward Officer Marshall, "Would you not be able to read?" like to state something in the room, changed everyone's gaze. He was immobile for a moment. Then, Gradually he stood up. His hands shook a little as he made adjustments, his voice and cleared his throat with his belt. Tough, but genuine. He paused, then compelled himself to meet their looks. I've believed for years that I was carrying out my duties properly, believing that was upholding the law, although I just realized tonight that I've been imposing my own prejudice instead. And as a result, I apologize. A wave of surprise passed through Marshall, swallowed hard from the crowd. I don't expect to continue. I don't expect trust, and I ask for pardon. Overnight, but rest assured that I'm going to improve. I'll begin by listening through education and ensuring my behavior demonstrates my regard for everyone. Of you warrants the brief silence in the room. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. Joined the increasing sound until it occupied Marshall's throat. Space. Tighter. But it wasn't coming from Sadly. It came from someone else. Something similar hope as the forum came to a close, and the audience Marshall stayed behind after being dispersed, knowing his adventure was only getting started. The forum gradually dwindled, but the enthusiasm lingered in the space like the fading. The sound of a strong symphony. Marshall remained sitting and gazed down at his hands. The evening's weight pushing down, Elijah walked slowly up to him. Briefly, prior to speaking, you took part in an activity tonight that many folks never have the opportunity to. You acknowledge that you were mistaken, Elijah said. Although it is the initial step, it is not. The Marshall's face appeared mixed up the last time. Of appreciation and fatigue, I'm not even sure where to start, he said. You begin subtly by appearing, Elijah, responded everywhere, not just here. You're required to go in order to hear and learn how change is how you make money. Trust, not just with words, but with Marshall nodded in agreement with the simplicity of the words that hit him. I really want to improve, he remarked. Elijah's voice was little more than a whisper. Examined him briefly before making a dim smile, then feel better. It's that easy, as challenging as that. As they left the building, Marshall felt lighter as he went. The future still appeared. The governor paused beside his SUV, looking intimidating, taking a final look at the officer. As you are aware, Elijah stated that people enjoy I ran for office because of you. Not to discipline, but, in my opinion, to alter. Even you, as an officer, can learn. Marshall gave a dry little laugh. Self-deprecating voice, I suppose. Elijah, we all have a lot of learning to do. In response, he opened the door of his car, but stopped before entering. This isn't only, it's about the people, not about you. Remember that you serve as Elijah. Dr. Marshall was standing in the parking lot far away, observing the taillights fade into, for the first time in years, the distance. It felt unmanly of him to enforce He felt as though he was learning the law. Comprehend it the following day. Marshall went back to work, carrying a notebook began to question as he reached inside his pocket. Inquiries he had never considered prior to participating in forums. He would have disregarded in conversing. He stayed away from the tales he had heard at the phrase community center, played repeatedly in his keep in mind that his acts have a lasting impact. Elijah was moved months later to receive it was a letter from Marshall in the mail. There was a message written by hand and an image of a recently formed community. In the note, the Police Relations Board. I still have a lot to do, Marshall wrote. Learn, but I'm becoming better thanks to allowing me to observe things. Elijah grinned differently as he read the words. The letter was put on his desk, and he reclined in his chair, and considered the small boy who made the most difficult request. Query of is it true that they won't like me at night? In any case, he was aware of the solution. The query was intricate, but tonight he had a glimmer of faith that one day it wouldn't be respected one day. Must be acquired by fear, or power would be used to demand that it be granted. Freely. Since it was correct, Governor Elijah's tale. Ted Marshall, an officer and porter, is a reminder that the first step towards transformation is recognition and develops via. If this story touched you, take action. Take a moment to consider how you can participate. Of the answer, pay attention and when. When the chance presents itself, show up and subscribe for additional inspirational tales and urge us to create a better world, collectively.